There is always a hush before revelation, a stillness that feels less like silence and more like the air gathering itself before a storm. Imagine a dim corridor of dreams, its walls lined with half-remembered whispers, and at the end of this passage, a door you have known existed but never dared to touch. When the empath finally reaches for that door, it does not open onto the narcissist alone. It opens onto the whole terrain of the self. This threshold is not a casual glance, but an initiation. Jung would call it the soul's rite of passage, where the drama between light and shadow ceases to be abstract and becomes the theater of one's own life. The empath steps forward with trembling perception. For years, perhaps decades, their sight has been filtered through longing, hope, and the urge to heal what was wounded in others, believing that enough love might redeem emptiness. The narcissist, dressed in masks of grandeur and mirrors of false light, became both stage and script. But now the empath's eyes begin to uncloud. What is seen in this moment is not merely another person's deception. It is the profound recognition that one has been walking a dream spun from wounds, archetypes, and the unconscious itself. The corridor narrows, the door opens, and the soul feels the quake of individuation beginning. This awakening does not arrive like a gentle sunrise. It is more like a lantern lit in a cave, revealing both beauty and terror. The empath realizes that every sacrifice, every abandoned desire, every silent no was not lost in vain, but gathered like sediment in the riverbed of the psyche. The confrontation with the narcissist becomes the confrontation with these layers of the self. The threshold moment carries paradox, grief and relief, clarity and vertigo. It is the recognition that what once felt like salvation was a rehearsal for true seeing. And here the voice of the guide, the one telling this story, the one you hear, leans closer. This is not only psychology, it is the myth of the soul cracking open, a mirror breaking so that light and shadow spill across the floor. The empath's journey is about to intensify. From this first step, a long arc begins. The passage from illusion into revelation, from projection into presence. Before we continue, let me invite you, the listener, into the circle. Comment below where you are watching from and what time it is, morning, midnight, or that twilight hour when silence seems alive. And if these words stir something in you, consider subscribing and activating the bell icon so you won't miss the next turning of this journey with us here on Carl Jung Stories Unveiled. Your presence gives life to this unfolding. Now the corridor is behind us. The door is open, and the room we enter is not empty, but filled with echoes of childhood and archetypal memory. This is where the story must move next, to the origin of the empath's wound, and to the figures, wounded healer and shadow king, who have been dancing together long before the first encounter in waking life. In the quiet aftermath of that first threshold, the empath stands not only before the narcissist, but before the roots of their own story. Childhood lingers like an invisible script. Many who walk this path have known what it means to love conditionally, where affection is granted when needs are met, and withheld when vulnerability shows. Such beginnings sow a hunger. If I can love enough, heal enough, anticipate enough, then perhaps I will finally be recognized. This hunger becomes the thread that guides the empath through later relationships, a thread that too often entangles with the narcissist's own unfinished symphony of wounds. The narcissist, for their part, is not simply a villain. They carry a hollow that frightens them into construction. Out of plaster and glitter, they build a palace of mirrors, grand but fragile. Jung might call this the ego's desperate defense, an overinflated persona meant to ward off the abyss. They wear a mask of kingship, yet beneath it lurks exile, the archetype of the shadow king, a ruler whose throne rests on sand. Their charisma beckons, promising depth and belonging, but the promise dissolves when touched. Here is where archetype meets archetype. The empath, heir to the wounded healer, cannot help but feel the call to repair, to soothe, to be the balm to another's silent scream. The narcissist, compelled by the hunger for validation, seeks a mirror bright enough to reflect grandeur and sturdy enough to absorb despair. The pairing is less random accident than mythic choreography. On the stage of the unconscious, the healer and the shadow king perform an ancient dance. Giver and taker, dreamer and illusionist, sacrifice and throne. At first, the empath mistakes this choreography for destiny. The intensity of early encounters feels like intimacy. Promises feel like presence. Attention feels like love. Yet the empath is not naive in a trivial sense. They are perceiving through archetypal imagination, projecting their own yearning for wholeness onto the luminous mask of the other. It is not foolishness, but the psyche reaching for its missing piece, only to grasp a reflection that cannot give what it seems to promise. Notice how the script deepens. The empath does not only fall for a person, but for an archetype. They surrender not to flesh and blood, but to the hope that finally, the unhealed child within them might be seen and soothed. The narcissist plays the role perfectly at first, attentive, magnetic, even tender. Yet this tenderness is conditional, bound to the cycle of admiration and control. The palace invites, but its rooms echo with emptiness. The empath's footsteps resound louder than their own voice, until they begin to realize the sound is not belonging, but abandonment replayed. This, then, is the architecture of entanglement. Two psyches colluding without knowing it. One offers endless giving to fill a well that has no bottom. The other accepts, yet recoils at true intimacy. Both are driven by wounds, different shapes, but of the same clay. The empath's early craving for recognition, the narcissist's terror of inner emptiness. These meet like opposite poles of a magnet, snapping together and refusing to release. Jung observed that the unconscious arranges these encounters as mirrors. To the empath, the narcissist is both tormentor and teacher, revealing what it means to mistake longing for love. To the narcissist, the empath is both adorer and threat, revealing the fragility of a mask too tightly held. The result is not harmony, but collision, yet the collision carries purpose. It is a mythic rehearsal, preparing the empath for the moment when illusion must collapse, when the spell can no longer hold. And so, at this stage of the story, we leave the origins exposed. The empath has carried a wound that makes them sensitive to the needs of others. The narcissist has built a persona to hide their own abyss. Their meeting is not random, but archetypal. Wounded healer and shadow king, caught in a dance neither fully understands. The empath may sense already that something feels unsustainable. The palace is too hollow, the mirrors too cracked, yet it will take more than unease to break the spell. What comes next is the shattering, the collapse of illusion that forces grief and awakening in equal measure. The spell always begins with radiance. The empath sees brilliance in the narcissist, not because it is false, but because it is unfinished. Charisma appears like substance, intensity masquerades as intimacy, and promises echo like presence. In the palace of mirrors, every gesture gleams brighter than it is. The empath, moved by archetypal imagination, invests these gestures with depth, weaving them into a story of redemption. For a time, both live inside this dream, yet all enchantments carry their breaking point. At first, the fissures are faint, a withdrawal after closeness, a sudden lash of coldness where warmth once burned, a promise unkept. The empath dismisses these shadows, believing they can be smoothed with greater love. But slowly, the palace reveals its true structure. Rooms once lit grow dim. The walls echo with emptiness rather than music, and the empath, once nourished by hope, begins to starve. This is the cycle: idealization, devaluation, abandonment. It is not linear but circular, a spiral pulling tighter with each turn. The empath gives and gives, believing the next offering will finally heal the void. The narcissist, fearing the intimacy of true contact, recoils, creating absence in the very space where presence was promised. The empath feels confusion, then despair, then resolve to try harder still. The narcissist, both king and captive of their own illusions, demands more adoration, more reflection. Together they rehearse the same myth until the stage collapses beneath them. When the spell shatters, it rarely feels like liberation. It feels like death. The empath's chest tightens with grief for a love that never truly existed, for the years or months spent building a home out of air. The loss is not only of the narcissist, but of the dream itself. Jung likened such collapse to the nigredo of alchemy, the blackening stage where matter decomposes so new life can form. Here, grief is not only an ending, but a crucible. The empath's mourning is multi-layered: sorrow for what was hoped, rage for what was given without return, shame for not seeing sooner. And yet within this storm lies the seed of transformation, for when illusion dies, so too does the compulsive hope that another might complete the self. The empath is forced, sometimes violently, into presence. They see at last that love offered to avoid cannot fill it, and that the hunger they tried to heal in another was also their own. This recognition is not self-blame, it is radical honesty. The narcissist's cruelty is real, their manipulation a wound they carry forward. But the empath, in facing the collapse, must also face the mirror. They see not only betrayal, but their own complicity. The ways in which longing blinded them, the ways in which fear of abandonment kept them tethered. This moment is searing because it is double-edged: pain for what was lost, and revelation of what was always missing. To describe the shattering without myth is impossible. It is as if Echo finally realizes her voice belongs not to Narcissus, but to herself. It is as if the dreamer in the labyrinth finds the Minotaur not outside, but within. These images do not minimize suffering, they give it form. They remind us that collapse is also initiation, that death of illusion is the first movement of rebirth. And so, the empath stands in ashes, the palace in ruins. The cycle cannot continue as before. There is nothing left to give into a bottomless well. This space, empty though it feels, is the threshold of transformation. Grief, paradoxically, is the beginning of freedom. The story now must turn inward. For once the spell is broken, the symbols of dream and myth arrive to guide the soul. Labyrinths, shadow figures, dangerous seducers, all carry instructions from the unconscious. The next stage of the journey belongs to these images, and it is through them that the empath begins to learn what healing demands. When the palace of mirrors lies in ruins, the unconscious begins to speak in symbols. It does not whisper in plain words, but paints the inner landscape with images that seem strange, even threatening. The empath, grieving yet alert, finds themselves wandering a labyrinth in dream. Corridors stretch endlessly, some leading nowhere, some looping back. At the center, a shadow moves. The Minotaur, both monster and secret keeper. Jung knew this figure well. The Minotaur is the hidden core of suffering, the unintegrated shadow that must be faced for the soul to move forward. These images are not fantasies for entertainment. They are blueprints of the psyche. In dreams, the narcissist may appear as a beautiful tyrant, magnetic and terrifying, demanding attention but never offering true presence. Or they may shrink to the figure of a wounded child, abandoned and crying in the dark. The empath, too, may appear wandering through empty houses, searching for rooms that promise safety but echo with absence. Each symbol is the psyche's way of translating pain into a story that can be navigated. The labyrinth itself carries paradox. On one hand, it disorients. The dreamer feels lost, turning corner after corner without exit. On the other, the very existence of the labyrinth signals readiness. The unconscious does not construct mazes without purpose. To walk its passages is to accept the initiation. To meet the Minotaur is to meet the hidden wound. Terrifying, yes, but also necessary. In this sense, the labyrinth is both prison and path, a structure designed not to trap, but to transform. Alchemy offers another image, Negredo, the blackening. After the collapse of illusion comes a stage of psychic winter, where the world seems stripped of color. Despair may feel absolute, but this blackness is the soil of rebirth. In the crucible of loss, the unconscious prepares the gold. The empath may feel broken, but in truth, they are being remade. This is where Jung's idea of active imagination becomes vital. Rather than fleeing the images, the empath can turn toward them. A dream of a desolate forest becomes an invitation to ask, what part of me feels abandoned here? A vision of the narcissist as a dragon or tyrant becomes a question. What power in me have I exiled to another's control? By dialoguing with these images, the empath shifts from passive sufferer to active participant in their own transformation. Symbols also protect. In myth, guides often appear when the hero descends into the underworld. Hermes with his lantern, Persephone as Queen of Shadows, Orpheus singing to the depths. The empath may encounter similar figures, a wise elder in a dream, a flicker of light in the corridor, a voice that offers a single reassuring phrase. These are not trivial hallucinations. They are the unconscious sending companions for the journey. At this stage, suffering becomes meaningful not by explanation, but by image. The narcissist is no longer simply an enemy, but a mirror, appearing in dream to remind the empath of what must be reclaimed. The Minotaur is not merely terror, but the keeper of treasure. The labyrinth is not punishment, but initiation. When these reinterpretations take hold, grief begins to soften into guidance. It is important to say, none of this erases pain. The empath will still feel the rawness of loss, the ache of betrayal. But now the pain has context. It is not endless chaos, but a passage structured by archetypes. The labyrinth has turns, but also a center. The Minotaur waits, but so does treasure. This recognition alone changes despair into endurance. Thus, the empath learns to follow the symbols rather than resist them. Each dream becomes a map, each image a signpost. Slowly, the pieces align. The wound is not a curse, but a doorway. The labyrinth is not a dead end, but a spiral path leading inward. And with this realization, the story bends again. The empath, once consumed by the narcissist's hunger, now begins to notice their own voice stirring. Boundaries whisper, discernment grows, compassion once unguarded seeks refinement. The labyrinth opens onto the task of reclaiming the self. Emerging from the labyrinth, the empath begins to hear something long buried, their own voice. For so long it was drowned beneath the clamor of another's needs, echoing like faint music in a room filled with storm. But now, in the silence after collapse, the voice grows clearer. It does not shout. It steadies. It says, "Your life is your own." Boundaries are the first architecture of this new inner house. Where once the empath poured without limit, believing that compassion meant erasure of self, they now learn that compassion has form. A vessel must have walls or it cannot hold water. Saying no is not cruelty, but reverence. Jung would call this the moment the ego begins to serve the self rather than abandon it. Every limit drawn is a door back to wholeness. Compassion itself transforms. It no longer bends under the weight of every demand. Instead, it becomes tempered, like metal forged in fire. Where once the empath confused intensity for intimacy, now they can discern. They see when someone's hunger is endless, when admiration demanded is not true connection. This is not cynicism, but wisdom, a compassion with boundaries, one that honors both the other and the self. This refinement carries paradox. Love does not end when boundaries appear. In fact, it deepens. Freed from compulsive giving, the empath can offer presence without depletion. They can sit with another's suffering without absorbing it, hold space without losing themselves. Tenderness becomes anchored rather than scattered. In this way, empathy matures from martyrdom into sovereignty. Dreams at this stage often shift tone. The narcissist may appear not as a tyrant, but as a broken child, or as an animal wounded and limping. The empath does not rush to rescue, but witnesses with clarity. This dream image signals integration, recognizing the shadow in another without confusing it for a summons to self-erasure. Likewise, the empath may dream of reclaiming lost objects, keys, voices, hidden rooms, symbols of pieces of the self returning home. With discernment, the empath also recognizes patterns in waking life. When the old hunger stirs, the urge to rescue, to merge, they pause. Instead of condemning themselves for feeling, they ask, "What part of me longs for recognition now?" This question shifts the dynamic. Longing becomes a messenger, not a trap. In this way, even desire itself is honored without being handed to the wrong altar. What emerges is a new kind of strength. Not the brittle armor of denial, nor the soft exhaustion of endless giving, but a quiet power rooted in balance. This strength does not need to dominate, nor does it vanish into servitude. It simply stands, steady, clear-eyed, and available for authentic connection. Here, the narcissist's role in the story changes. No longer savior or destroyer, they become symbol, a reminder of how easy it is to lose oneself and how necessary it is to return. The empath can now see them without enchantment. The mask is visible, the hunger transparent. There may still be sadness, even compassion, but there is no compulsion to merge. This is freedom of a subtler kind. As this transformation unfolds, the empath begins to discover new expressions of their gift. Sensitivity becomes intuition rather than burden. Compassion becomes presence rather than sacrifice. Their energy, once consumed by rescuing, now flows into creativity, relationship, and spiritual practice. The self they once abandoned becomes the center from which they engage the world. And so, the wounded healer archetype evolves. It no longer seeks healing through others' wounds, but brings healing by living authentically. The empath stands as both scar and lantern, aware of what has been endured, yet luminous in how they choose to love now. This stage does not promise perfection. Old patterns will whisper, shadows will return. But discernment has been born, and once born, it does not die. Boundaries can be redrawn. Compassion can be recalibrated. The path is no longer blind repetition, but conscious engagement. From here, the journey points toward integration itself. The empath has reclaimed voice and boundary. Now the task is to weave shadow and light, wound and gift into a whole. Individuation awaits. The return not just to survival, but to fullness. Wholeness does not arrive as a trumpet blast. It enters more like dawn through a half-open window, slow, insistent, tender. The empath who has crossed thresholds, mourned illusions, walked labyrinths, and reclaimed their voice now stands at the edge of integration. Individuation, as Jung framed it, is not the polishing of a perfect self, but the weaving of opposites into a single fabric. Shadow and light no longer battle, they converse. At this point, the narcissist fades from being a central figure into a symbolic role. They are no longer adversary, no longer rescuer, but messenger. Their presence revealed the empath's unhealed hunger, and by surviving that encounter, the empath reclaimed what was lost. To see the narcissist clearly is to see one's own reflection more honestly. And this clarity is not bitter, it is liberating. The work of integration is slow. Old wounds rise like tides, sometimes pulling the empath back into doubt or longing. But each return to shadow is an invitation, not a failure. In dream, the narcissist may still appear, but now as a fragment, a child, an animal, a lantern bearer. These images no longer command, they guide. They remind the empath that all banished parts of the psyche must be welcomed home. In daily life, wholeness manifests quietly. The empath notices they no longer rush to rescue. They allow silence in conversations. They trust their own rhythms, rather than bending to every storm of another's moods. Compassion remains, but it is seasoned with discernment. Tenderness persists, but it does not dissolve the self. This is sovereignty, not domination, not withdrawal, but a centered presence in the world. Such sovereignty often feels unfamiliar. The empath may ask, "Who am I without the drama of saving? Who am I when my love is no longer a sacrifice?" The answer comes not in declarations, but in practice. Each day lived from the center, each boundary honored, each dream recorded and reflected upon, strengthens the thread of individuation. The empath discovers joy not as escape, but as participation. Walking in nature, creating art, sharing connection without losing essence. In this integrated state, suffering is not erased, but transmuted. Pain becomes wisdom. Longing becomes creativity. Even scars become maps, reminders of passages survived. The empath emerges neither as victim nor savior, but as a soul among souls, carrying both wound and wonder. They embody Jung's paradox. To be whole is to include all parts, not to perfect them away. The world itself feels altered through these new eyes. Encounters once draining become opportunities for choice. Solitude once feared becomes a sanctuary. Relationships shift. Some end, others deepen, but all are met with clarity. The empath understands at last that what was sought in others must be cultivated within. Wholeness is not found in a mirror, but in the self, the radiant center that has been waiting all along, and so the circle closes. The empath who once wandered a labyrinth of mirrors now carries a lantern of their own. The narcissist remains part of their story, yes, but no longer the author of it. The great work, opus magnum, continues, not toward perfection, but toward an ever-expanding wholeness. This is not the end, but a new beginning. For individuation is lifelong, a spiral that revisits wounds and memories, yet each time with deeper understanding. The empath is now an initiate, able to walk forward with steadiness, compassion, and sovereignty. The task ahead is simple, though never easy: to live each day as an unfolding of the self, to trust the slow rhythm of transformation, to honor both shadow and light as companions. From this place, the empath is free to bring their gift to the world, not through sacrifice, but through presence. And so the story prepares to rest. The palace has crumbled, the labyrinth has been walked, the Minotaur faced, the voice reclaimed. What remains is the quiet miracle, the empath, whole, luminous, and grounded, stepping into life not as rescuer or martyr, but as themselves. The end of one journey is always the beginning of another. The empath, having endured the collapse of illusion and the crucible of grief, now walks with a new kind of light. It is not the blazing fire of conquest, nor the fragile glow of borrowed flame. It is the steady ember of the self, quiet, enduring, alive. Jung often reminded us that individuation is not a final destination, but a process, a lifelong spiral. The empath will return again and again to familiar corridors, longing, shadow, silence, desire. Yet each return is different. What once felt like imprisonment now feels like passage. The labyrinth that seemed endless reveals itself as a path designed for deepening, not for despair. 3 pillars anchor this closing chapter. The first is patience. Trust the slow work of transformation. Just as a seed cannot be forced to bloom, the soul cannot be rushed into wholeness. Every setback, every relapse, every shadow that reappears is part of the rhythm. The second is reversal. The labyrinth is not a prison, but a path. To walk its winding turns in is to honor the psyche's way of unfolding. The third is revelation. At the center waits not a monster, but the self, radiant and unbroken. The empath discovers that what they sought outside, recognition, intimacy, belonging, was never absent, only hidden beneath layers of projection and fear. From here, the final cadence arrives like ritual. Trust the darkness. Trust the journey. Trust the light. Dare to enter your own depths. Dare to welcome the shadow. Dare to love what you find. These imperatives are not demands, but blessings, invitations to keep the fire of individuation alive beyond the telling of this tale. And so the empath's narrative shifts. No longer is their identity chained to saving, rescuing, or enduring. Instead, they embody sovereignty, a gentle strength that does not need validation to stand, a compassion that is clear-eyed rather than consuming. They are not free from suffering, but they are free within it, able to transmute pain into meaning, grief into wisdom, and longing into creativity. The narcissist, too, is re-seen. No longer giant, no longer tyrant, but symbol, a mirror of wounds and shadows, a teacher of boundaries. In releasing the enchantment, the empath frees both parties, one from the role of rescuer, the other from the role of captor. The story is no longer about dominance or collapse, but about the reclaiming of wholeness. The empath now belongs not to the maze of another's hunger, but to the vast, unfolding journey of the self. And that journey is endless. Each day carries a new image, a new dream, a new chance to return home. If you find yourself within these words, if you too have walked the labyrinth of illusion, take heart. You are not alone. This path is ancient. It winds through myth and memory, through suffering and revelation. And at its center, waiting patiently, is the self you have always been.